5 worst combat roles in history. My vote's on the guy with the flamethrower. What's yours? Let's go.
War is hell, but throughout history there have been certain combat roles which were especially dangerous, terrifying, or just plain disturbing. So just in case you thought that the odds of surviving a battle weren't bad enough, here are 5 combat roles from history which show that things could always be worse. Number 5. The Tunnel
Mr.
Rats.
Uplifting.
During the War for Independence against France, Vietnamese forces began digging deep underground tunnels to serve as escape routes and hiding places.
No,
However,
thanks.
against the better supplied and technologically superior American forces during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong expanded the network of tunnels which eventually grew to an intricate labyrinth of chambers, winding passageways, and bunkers which spread for thousands of miles. Viet Cong forces would emerge from the underground fortresses to launch lightning-fast hit-and-run raids before melting away to the relative safety of the tunnels before the might of the American war machine could be turned against them. Knowing that they stood little chance against the US forces on the open ground, these kind of guerrilla raids became the Viet Cong's favoured strategy. The incredible network of tunnels connected villages that were miles apart and even linked different provinces, enabling forces to move between locations unseen and protected underground, safe from the intense bombing.
Can you imagine all the work that went into that? Dig those tunnels in that clay and rock. That must have been terrible. I think the worst job, though, would be the tunnel rat job. Let's go.
Carried out by the US Air Force on the surface. Yet these tunnels were not only a place to hide or move around unseen, they were also used to store weapons, supplies, and food, and in many places even had air, sanitation, and cooking facilities, along with hospitals, print shops, and stages for political theatre. Thousands of soldiers spent several years living in the underground tunnels, only emerging from the darkness to conduct combat missions. To combat this threat, the US Army tried flooding the tunnels, or using gas to kill or flush out those sheltering
I don't think
within.
that worked.
However, the sheer size of the tunnels, combined with ingenious but simple water locks, meant that these attempts had little success. The army even tried sending attack dogs into the tunnels to kill the Viet Cong soldiers. However, the dogs were quickly destroyed by the numerous traps lining the tight passageways. It was decided that the only way to destroy the tunnels and chambers was to send in specialized soldiers to clear them out and blow them up one by one. The tunnel rats were born. Consisting of soldiers from the US, Australia, and New Zealand, the tunnel rats were usually volunteers who were tasked with descending into the tunnels to kill or capture Viet Cong soldiers, retrieve any intelligence, and destroy or disable the tunnels where possible. The men chosen needed to be small and thin to stand a better chance of making their way through the tight.
That sounds like a terrible job. I worked with a guy, he was a first sergeant, and he was a tunnel rat in Vietnam. He was about 5'3", wiry like they described, but you couldn't miss the huge scar on his face. Never talked about it, but I'm sure he had some stories to tell.
Confines of the passageway, and all of them were highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat, a skill which they were expected to rely on regularly, as the limited space made larger
look at
weapons
that.
impractical.
No
Upon
thanks.
discovering the camouflaged access holes which led to the tunnels, the tunnel rats would check the area for any booby traps before descending into the darkness below. The first man would be lowered in armed with just a pistol, bayonet, and flashlight, where he would search the immediate areas for traps before being joined by a second man. The man taking point would have the perilous task of moving forward in the darkness, usually with his flashlight off, so as not to alert enemy soldiers who may be lurking ahead of him. He had to be acutely aware of booby traps which would often line the tunnel, disarming them where possible, while the second man planned the tunnel's demolition. Every inch of the tunnel could prove deadly, with the Viet Cong's favoured traps including bamboo tubes containing poisonous snakes which were rigged to tripwires,
My lord.
and small holes in the tunnels which enemy soldiers hiding on the other side would plunge spears through, impaling the tunnel rat as he crawled past.
I don't know if this job was punishment or what. I mean, what do you guys think? Put that in the comments.
The men's senses were constantly on alert, as they desperately strained to hear the sound of a man breathing ahead, smell his sweat, or see any movement which might indicate that death was near. It's hard to imagine the terror of being trapped in a dark, suffocating tunnel, knowing that anyone you might encounter in this hellish underworld would gladly kill you in an instant. In the heat and dirt, the men would crawl forward inch by inch, often covering hundreds of yards, prepared to fight for their life at every turn. Clearing the tunnel and setting the explosives could take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the size of the complex and how much resistance the men met. However, to the tunnel rats, every minute felt like an eternity.
I guess.
Unsurprisingly, very few of the tunnel rats would survive the war, and each soldier knew that every trip into the subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and caverns was likely to be his last, yet still the men pressed on. Number 4.
That's got to be some of the toughest combat in any war. I mean, you're going into a tunnel with a pistol, a bayonet, and a light. That's it. Explosives. It's tiny. You shoot your pistol. God only knows if the thing's going to cave in on your head. You can't use the light so you don't get seen. What a disaster. You guys be interested in that job? Not me.
The Galley Rover. Before the advent of the steam engine, seafaring vessels had two options when it came to propulsion: the free but unreliable winds, or pure human brute force. Although sails could harness the power of the wind, a calm day would leave you drifting at the mercy of the sea, whereas human muscle could always be relied on in the form of galley rowers to propel your ship whatever the weather. Contrary to popular belief, ancient galley rowers tended not to be slaves, and were instead free men who were well respected for their profession.
I don't think these guys need to go to the gym and do their CrossFit. I'm sure these guys were broken backs, ended up discarded when this was all over.
Well, the lives of all on board were reliant on the talents of the men rowing the galley. Therefore, ancient navies tended to shy away from placing their very survival in the hands of unskilled and unreliable slaves. Although the work was hard and conditions were tough, the job was an honourable one, and the men were well treated and respected by their countrymen. However, the life of the galley rower would change dramatically between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. The grim era of the galley slave was born.
I don't want to take away from this, but I'm not sure what the skill is to rowing. It sounds just like a job of brute force. What do you guys think?
These desperately scrambled to crew their galley fleets with whichever unfortunate souls they could seize. The practice became especially common in France, where the king ordered judges to sentence men to the galleys for their crimes, instead of issuing the death penalty.
Wow.
A minimum sentence of 10 years was issued to criminals found guilty of a variety of different crimes. However, such a sentence was usually considered to be as good as death, as men would be unlikely to survive the battles to come, or the terrible conditions they had to endure on the galleys. And even if they did survive, there was rarely anyone who would check or care to see when your sentence was complete, resulting in many galley rowers serving years longer than the term they had originally been given. Unable to move and chained to the benches, the rowers would often develop sores on their body, caused by the friction of the chains as they rowed, wounds that could easily become infected in the unsanitary conditions, resulting in even more deaths. However, to the men in charge, the rowers were simply disposable tools, and there were always more criminals and captured enemy soldiers ready to replace them. Even if the men somehow managed to survive these terrible conditions, they still had to contend with the greatest danger of all: battle on the open seas. In the heat of battle, the men were not rowing for the victory of their side, but for their very survival. Chained down below, the ship and the men's fate were intertwined. Barbary pirates operating out of bases across North Africa were especially feared enemies, and any galley slaves who fell into the pirates' hands would face a lifetime of slavery with no possibility of release. In fact, the entire Barbary coast was...
Alright, I take that all back. I don't want to be a galley rower. That's the worst combat job. What do you guys think?
...to a thriving slaving industry between 1500 to 1800. And pirates operating out of North Africa terrorized Mediterranean coastal communities and merchant vessels, even going so far as to launch land-based raids in their quest to capture even greater numbers of people to be sold for profit.
That, to me, is not a quick death. At least the tunnel rat, you may get stabbed or shot. But that looks terrible.
Operator. The desire to set your enemy on fire is nothing new, and man has done his best to weaponize flame for thousands of years. Yet the modern flamethrower as we know it was first put to deadly effect during the First and Second World Wars. Designed to project a long stream of accurate flame, the weapon seemed like an ideal way to break the stalemate of trench warfare, either by incinerating enemy soldiers sheltering inside fortifications, or causing them to flee for their lives, where they could be gunned down while out in the open and exposed.
Alright, think about this in a modern day context. Can you imagine if we used this in the desert? So you got somebody in a building, won't come out, you're going to have to kick the door down. Just use the flamethrower in the window. Put that in the comments. How would that go over?
During the Second World War, the weapon saw widespread use as a way to assault heavily defended positions such as bunkers and pillboxes, where the soldiers sheltering inside could be burnt alive or flushed out by the intense flames, with the stream of flammable liquid able to bounce off walls and ceilings, thus reaching blind spots and hard-to-reach spaces. There truly was no hiding from the weapon, and the appearance of flamethrowers on the battlefield gave the side using them a distinct psychological advantage. In the Pacific Campaign, flamethrowers were credited with saving Allied lives, as they enabled the deep caves and bunker complexes the Japanese were sheltering in to be cleared out from a distance, the deadly flames either burning alive the unfortunate men inside, or simply consuming all of the available oxygen, suffocating anyone left untouched by the fire. Yet the flamethrower operators didn't have things all their own way, and undertaking...
This fellow right here is a Medal of Honor recipient. I got a video coming out about him, but you talk about a warrior. Williams' last name, Woody, his nickname. Take a look at him.
This role was a highly risky and stressful proposition. There were a variety of deadly risks associated with using flamethrowers in combat, a fact which meant that the chances of you being taken prisoner alive were slim, and in many cases flamethrower operators were summarily executed by the opposite side.
Think about that. You've got a bomb on your back. It gets shrapnel. It gets shot. Does it malfunction? No, thank you.
From snipers, and should their bullets miss your body, they could very well hit the flammable liquid inside the weapon's tanks, causing you and friendly soldiers nearby to be engulfed in flames. Due to the fuel mixture being somewhat difficult to light with a bullet, the risk was still very much real, and was likely to be constantly haunting the man operating the flamethrower, causing him to be under a permanent state of stress.
Okay, let's say it doesn't blow up from a bullet, but you get a hole in it. So you go to fire that joker up and you're shooting blanks. No bueno.
This mental stress would have likely been something that slowly ground the individual down, as each battle was spent witnessing the terrible results of your handiwork, seeing men engulfed in flames, screaming in pain, and slowly dying, knowing that it was you who caused this suffering. The endless stream of charred bodies and the smell of burning human flesh undoubtedly had a huge psychological impact upon the flamethrower operator, and combined with the constant danger you were in, would have been enough to tip even a balanced individual over the edge. With such risks associated with the use of the flamethrower, the weapons were soon phased out as many of the disadvantages could be removed by mounting the weapons on armoured vehicles, and since 1978 they have not been used in the US arsenal.
What's the good reason there? I don't know. You guys put that in the comments. What's the good reason not to use flamethrowers? Drop bombs? We use every other method, but a flamethrower seems like it'd really terrify your enemy.
Of one Marine Corps flamethrower unit, which was deployed to Iwo Jima, found that the operators suffered a massive 92% casualty rate, with one military statistician...
Did you hear that? 92% casualty rate. Unreal.
Estimating their average lifespan during the battle to be just 4 minutes. During both World Wars, the German U-boat operated as a highly feared and deadly killing machine that was skillfully used by its crew to launch attacks on unsuspecting Allied warships and merchant convoys which were supplying the British war effort. In fact, they were so effective that they came close to single-handedly turning the entire Second World War in the favour of Germany by nearly choking off desperately needed supplies coming into mainland Britain. During the Battle of the Atlantic, the men selected to crew the U-boats were the cream of the crop, and the chosen few who made it through the rigorous screening process were generally intelligent and skilled young men who wore...
The Germans were the pioneers with submarines, U-boats, and that created havoc for the US Navy.
Uniform with great pride. However, it's unlikely that many of the young recruits knew the reality of the life which was awaiting them deep beneath the waves. With space so limited, the crew often had to resort to hot bunking, where as soon as a bunk became available, another man would crawl into the still warm bed to take his turn at attempting to get some rest.
That's pretty typical in submarines now. There's only so much space, even on ships, so the hot bunking thing to me is a nothing burger. Being on there, not being able to bathe, not being able to take care of yourself on a new technology would be scary.
The day was split into 3 8-hour shifts, one for sleeping, one for regular duties, and one for miscellaneous tasks. Yet the day provided little variety, and the work could be mind-numbingly monotonous.
Any of you guys ever work on a submarine? I've been in one a few times, and that was enough for me. I feel for those guys that are stuck down there for 6 months at a time, no less back then. Let me know that in the comments.
As the war dragged on and the Allies grew more adept at hunting down and destroying U-boats, the crewmen's chances of survival plummeted. In fact, some estimates put the casualty rates for U-boat crews as high as 75%, with average life expectancies as short as 3 months. Submerged for nearly 24 hours per day, for fear of being spotted by the enemy, the hunters had now become the hunted, as Allied forces relentlessly searched for any U-boats still lurking beneath the waves. It's likely that for many U-boat crewmen, the last thing they would have experienced was the sound of sonar pings, followed by the trail of exploding depth charges getting closer and closer, until finally the walls around them caved in.
What do you guys think number 1 is? Put that in the comments. I have no idea, haven't seen it, but I can't wait. Let's go.
The Penal Battalion.
Boy,
For as long as
Penal
wars have been
Battalion.
fought, criminals and other undesirables have been viewed as useful but disposable cannon fodder, men of little worth who will not be missed, and can therefore be used to undertake dangerous missions or carry out unpleasant tasks that are beneath regular soldiers. Legions consisting of criminals, slaves, and even those in financial debt were used against Hannibal's invading Carthaginian army.
Did you guys hear that? If you were in debt, you could be a penal soldier. Imagine today, 99% of the country would be working for the government.
Armed men promised freedom in exchange for victory as the Republic fought for its very survival.
I wonder how the morale was in that unit. What do you guys think?
Power shortages becoming an ever greater problem during the later years of the Napoleonic Wars, even hardened criminals began being conscripted into the penal units as a way to bolster the army's fighting potential. The Germans had used soldiers who were deemed to be disruptive to general morale, but otherwise worthy of service, in specialized penal units. However, with the war turning against them, all types of prisoners, convicted soldiers, and even hardened criminals were conscripted into the ranks in a desperate bid to stave off defeat, as well as the promise that should they serve with bravery, they might be allowed to return to regular.
It's one of the few times I would say I'd become a deserter. I'm not sure I'd stay for this deal.
Army units. In reality, they had little choice in the matter, for refusal to carry out their often suicidal missions would result in summary execution of their original sentence, used as cannon fodder to defend a chosen location where they would sacrifice their lives to buy just enough time for regular army units to escape before the position.
They don't even get lied to about what their purpose is. You get a lot of young troops that are cannon fodder, but these guys know going in. They're just there to be bodies. That's it.
Was overrun. In fact, the odds of survival for these missions were so bleak that they would often be referred to as Journey to Heaven missions. However, when fighting anywhere other than the Eastern Front, the men tended to simply surrender at the first possible opportunity.
Yeah, no kidding. You can fight and get taken prisoner and probably be treated better than you would be as a penal soldier. What would you guys do?
Many of the units also had little prior military training, and although effective against unarmed civilians and poorly trained partisans, they stood little chance against veteran Red Army units. One of the most infamous of these units was the 36th Grenadier Division of the Waffen-SS, in an effort to weaponize Germany's most dangerous and insane men, turning them loose on the conquered lands of the East. The unit quickly gained a reputation for extreme brutality towards civilians, falling under the command of Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted child molester whose atrocities are said to have been so extreme that other SS commanders openly voiced their displeasure at his methods.
Why does he look like a child molester to me? I just see the picture and I say child molester. I can imagine this unit's morale and leadership needed some work by today's standard. What do you guys think?
The majority of the 50,000 men who were thought to have been deployed in penal units by the German army were simply petty criminals, soldiers who had displayed an unwillingness to fight, or simply those unfortunate enough to have been deemed undesirable for any number of reasons. However, this number is dwarfed by the estimated 430,000 men who were used in penal battalions by the Soviet army, where such units were arranged into a formidable yet disturbingly expendable force.
So you figure the Soviets used 500,000 approximately. Not even draftees, right? These guys said, you're going to go fight for us or we're hanging you. No thanks.
In an effort to install discipline and halt the panicked retreats caused by the German offensive into the Soviet Union, Stalin issued the infamous Order No. 227 in July 1942, which would lead to a massive increase in the size of the Red Army's penal units. The order became widely known as the Not One Step Back order, and effectively banned the use of retreat as a military tactic. From now on, anyone found to be retreating would face severe punishment, which could include on-the-spot execution. The punishment was supposed to be temporary, where the disgraced soldier could redeem himself through heroic actions, or by suffering an injury in battle. However, in reality, this promise of redemption was usually just a lie told to ensure that the men did not enter open revolt. The men sent to the penal units had been earmarked for death one way or another, and
I don't think if they get hurt they're going back home to a big parade, do you?
unlikely to survive the war. The NKVD secret police units who commanded the penal battalions viewed the men with disdain, as common cannon fodder to be expended in battle. There are even reports of them being dressed in dark uniforms instead of snow camouflage, in an effort to draw enemy fire away from the regular Red Army units.
I would call them more like bait. They're not fighting for their country, they're forced to fight in effective slavery. This must have been terrible morale and the last-ditch effort to get some fighting warriors for the Russians or the Germans.
With such terrible odds, retreat might seem like the sensible approach. However, behind the penal units were soldiers known as barrier troops, which were specialized forces tasked with gunning down anyone running away from the fighting. Unsurprisingly, penal battalions would often be wiped out to the last man in an attack, and very few of the nearly 500,000 men who served in such units are thought to have escaped the war with their lives.
What do you think is the worst combat role in history? Are these 5 qualify, or do you have another one? Put it in the comments. New to the channel, thanks for stopping by. For my current subscribers, I appreciate you. Thanks for watching.